Look at this line. A perfectly straight line cutting through the Sahara Desert, through villages, through families, through entire peoples. This is the border between Algeria and Libya, and it was drawn with a ruler, literally, in an office in Europe, by men who had never been there. And that's just the beginning. Over 40% of all African borders are perfect geometric lines. This isn't a coincidence. This is a story of arrogance, greed, and consequences that are still costing lives today. Imagine aliens came to Earth and redrew Europe. Germany suddenly gets cut diagonally in half. Bavaria now belongs to Austria, Hamburg to Denmark. The border runs straight through Berlin. Insane, right? That's exactly what happened to Africa. But it wasn't aliens. It was something almost as distant from African reality. 1884. It's winter in Berlin. Chancellor Otto von Bismarck hosts a conference. The most powerful nations in Europe gather around a table. France, Great Britain, Portugal, Belgium, even the United States sends representatives. On the table, a map of Africa, most of it blank, huge sections labeled unexplored territories. These men are about to divide an entire continent, and not a single African is in the room. Here's what's insane. Most of these European powers haven't even explored the interior of Africa. They control a few coastal forts, some trading posts. The rest? They're guessing. But that doesn't stop them from making rules. If you control a piece of coastline, you can claim as far inland as you want. Just plant your flag and it's yours. A race begins. The scramble for Africa. Now, you might think, okay, they drew some bad borders. People adapted, right? Wrong. Because these borders didn't just split land, they split lives. Let me show you what I mean through the story of the Somali people. One ethnic group, one language, one culture. They've been herding livestock across the Horn of Africa for centuries, following seasonal rains, following their traditions. Then the Europeans arrive, and suddenly the same family finds themselves divided between British, Italian, and French territories. Your brother is now British Somaliland. Your Italian Somaliland. Your cousin? French Somaliland. But it gets worse. When these colonies gained independence, those colonial borders became international borders. Today, the Somali people are split between 5 different countries: Somalia, Djibouti, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Somaliland. The conflicts over these divisions have killed hundreds of thousands. And the Somalis aren't unique. Look at these straight lines cutting across the Sahara. Each one slices through the traditional territories of nomadic peoples, as example the Tubu, the Tuareg, or the Fulani. These aren't people who lived in one place. Their entire culture is built on movement, following water, following grazing lands, routes they've traveled for thousands of years. Now imagine you're a Tubu herder. Your family has moved between the same seasonal pastures for generations. But in 1960, you wake up and those pastures are suddenly in 2 different countries, Libya and Chad. Your annual migration? Now it's illegal border crossing. Your livestock? Smuggled goods. Your way of life, perfected over millennia, is now a crime, because of a line drawn by someone who never even saw a desert. Now here's where the story gets darker, because you might think these borders were just careless mistakes, random acts of ignorance. They weren't. Look at Nigeria. The British had a choice. They could have created separate colonies for the Muslim North, the Christian South, and the Yoruba West, 3 distinct regions with different cultures. Instead, they deliberately smashed them together into one colony. Why? Because the British Empire had learned something over centuries of colonization. Divided populations are easier to control. If the Igbo, Hausa, and Yoruba are competing with each other, they're not uniting against British rule. This wasn't incompetence. This was strategy, weaponized borders, and it worked. Nigeria has been plagued by ethnic and religious tensions since independence, including a brutal civil war that killed millions. That's not ancient tribal hatred. That's the direct result of British colonial policy. So why don't they just change the borders now? It's been decades since independence. Surely African nations could redraw these colonial lines, right? Create borders that actually make sense? And here's where the tragedy deepens. Because they tried, sort of. In 1964, African leaders gathered and made a decision. They agreed to keep the colonial borders, permanently. They called it the principle of uti possidetis. You keep what you possess. Why would they do that? Why would they accept borders drawn by their oppressors? Because they realize something terrifying. If you change even one border, where do you stop? There are over 3,000 ethnic groups in Africa. If the Somalis get to unite, why not the Tuareg? If the Tuareg unite, why not the Hausa? If the Hausa, why not the Igbo? Suddenly, you're not redrawing a few borders. You're potentially creating hundreds of new countries, civil wars everywhere, neighbors invading neighbors, continental chaos. So African leaders made an impossible choice: accept unjust borders to avoid total catastrophe. But that stability they hoped for, it never really came. Sudan split into Sudan and South Sudan in 2011 after decades of civil war. The border they drew still makes no sense, and they're still fighting over it. The Rwandan genocide in 1994, where 800,000 people died in 100 days, traces directly back to how the Belgians artificially hardened divisions between Hutus and Tutsis, groups that weren't even separate ethnicities before colonization. Right now, today, the Sahel region is engulfed in violence, ethnic conflicts in Ethiopia, resource wars in the Congo. All of these, if you trace them back, lead to those rooms in Berlin, Paris, and London where borders were drawn. Africa's borders don't make sense because they were never meant to make sense for Africans. 14 men sat in a room in Berlin and divided 800 million people in 100 days. They did it for resources, they did it for power, they did it with rulers and guesswork, and the consequences have lasted 140 years. There's no easy solution now. Changing the borders risks war, keeping them perpetuates injustice, but at minimum, we need to stop pretending these borders are somehow natural or legitimate. They're not, they're scars, colonial scars that never healed. And until we acknowledge that, really acknowledge it, we'll never understand why so many of Africa's conflicts seem senseless. They're not senseless. They're the predictable result of senseless borders. That's why Africa's borders make no sense, because they were never drawn for Africa.